focuses on how marginalized communities adapt digital technologies to meet their needs and to pursue their goals. She is the author of Invisible Users, Youth in the Internet Cafes of Urban Ghana. If you haven't had the pleasure of reading that yet, I strongly suggest you do. As well as several articles around machine learning, such as How the Machine Thinks, Understanding Opacity, and the Society of Algorithms. Jenna was a faculty member at the School of Information at UC Berkeley between 2007 and 2022. And she went through assistant associate and full professor while there. While at Berkeley, she was co-director of the Algorithmic Fairness and Opacity Group, which she ran with the law scholar Deirdre Mulligan. And after that, seeking an opportunity to ensure that this research on technology and society reaches and has a broader impact, she was also the director of research at Data and Society in 2021 for 2 years. And then, without further ado, I just want to hand over to Jenna now.
Yeah, pull up my slides here. All right. There we go. Does that look right? Okay. All right. Then I'm going to get started. Jonathan, thank you for the introduction. I'm excited to get to kind of be in a room, another space with you. Jonathan was a PhD student at Berkeley when I was there, and we got to collaborate. I actually worked in a little bit about our collaboration towards the end of this talk, which hopefully we'll have time to get into, because it was one of my joys in my time at Berkeley and in my time collaborating with the amazing people who came through there to get to work on a project with Janaki. But today, what I'm mostly going to talk about is, well, I want to do two things. I want to talk about two things. One, I wanted to present some kind of substantive findings from semi-recent ethnographic research. And I, for a bit there, I was doing work that was really about like AI ethics. And so because this is the ethnographic digital research seminar, I was like, oh, good, I have a chance to kind of return to the work that I think, honestly, I enjoy the most, which is doing ethnographic work and getting out into the world and talking to people about, usually about some technology they're using, but kind of using that as an excuse to go places that are just really far outside of my kind of normal everyday life. So I want to talk about this research that I did in rural Oregon on the arrival of a Facebook data center and what that meant in that community. But I also want to hopefully spend a little bit of time talking about methods. I moved to Yokohama, Japan. I'm talking to you from across a lot of different time zones right now. It's really late at night where I am. And since I've moved here, I've mostly spent my time kind of getting adjusted, getting my family settled in. But I also recently, a month ago, started writing a research methods book, which is sort of a big dream, is to take 15 years of teaching research methods, qualitative, ethnographic, kind of the digital, and take all of that kind of experience and all those conversations with students and turn it into a book. So any chance to talk about methods, I'm really excited to have, especially right now. So as for the substantive findings, I'm going to talk about, I did this project looking at rural workplaces in the Western United States. The data center was one of them, but I wasn't really limiting myself just to data centers. I was also looking at traditional rural industries, so like wood products, the timber industry, cattle ranching in particular. And I have this book chapter coming out on the persistence of certain masculine occupational values. I'm calling them embodied masculinity in the wake of digital tech adoption. It's coming out in an edited book with Duke. It has a date now. I think I could say 2026 now. I have the preprints in hand. It's the title's Media Rurality, and the editors are Patrick Brody and Darren Barney. So keep an eye out for that book. And if you want a copy of my preprint, just email me. So because this is a digital ethnography seminar, I wanted to talk about, navigating some of these unique methodological questions that really arise from studying the ways that everyday life has become digitally mediated globally. And I've seen, since I did my PhD, also in the UK, I'm a graduate of the sociology department at LSE, 2007, way back in 2007. I've been sort of asking the same kinds of questions and answering them in different ways over several decades. For one thing, the technology itself has changed. So I did a dissertation project on internet cafes in Ghana. I don't really think those exist, at least not in the same way anymore. Things have shifted to laptops, to mobile phones, so the tech has changed. Tech has moved into different parts of social life. And some aspects of digital life, digitalization are just so ubiquitous and so mainstream. I think they become kind of difficult to study because they're so mundane. And then I also sort of want to frame this around research questions that I really found compelling throughout my career that are present in this piece of ethnographic work. While my PhD is in sociology, I've turned especially to themes and theories from science and technology studies and anthropology, material culture studies. And the baseline is really that I see this encounter in all of the places where I've done work. I've seen this encounter between technologies, between new material forms, and between people as a sort of co-construction. And the question for me is always, what is the outcome of that co-construction in a particular time and place? And to me, it's endlessly fascinating. It doesn't matter where, when, what time, what era. It continues to kind of fascinate me to see the answers to that question. And I also want to frame this just at this stage of my career, thinking about like, why does any of this matter? Why are we doing this work? And we've seen many cycles of tech hype. We're sort of being carried along this enormous hype wave around generative AI. And hype always seems to carry the same debunked theory of tech in society, which is essentially a fatalistic one. And it's that tech is what it is, and we humans have to adapt to its prescribed reality. And the best way I know to counter that tech hype, given the training I've had, given the kind of scholar I am, is to keep producing these sorts of ethnographic accounts about how tech users are always sort of reinventing tech, either materially or symbolically through use, and also how people who are impacted by tech, who are non-users, do things to either resist or refuse or redirect the way tech is impacting their lives. And I think that's something ethnographic work is really well suited for. And part of telling those ethnographic accounts, those stories, is about defending the validity of those actions, like the way that people are using tech, the validity of those actions within the context of those lives that are impacted. That surprises in tech adoption and use are not automatically tech misuse, just because they weren't anticipated by people who build tech. And I've recently seen accounts about people misusing generative AI tools. And I'm like, what does that even mean? When these tools were built without a clear purpose or use in mind. And I have found a little bit of success trying to educate colleagues and students and other people who build tech to kind of investigate why they call things misuse and to reconsider that kind of framing. Okay, so moving into the substance of the talk, I'm going to talk about this project to look at I ended up looking at data centers in Central Oregon, and I think the ethnographic question often starts with like, if you're studying the digital, where do you go to do that? Because the digital is not a place you can go to. It's not a community. It's a sort of ephemeral thing. And in this particular project, I started not in Central Oregon. I started along the coast of California in this little town called Manchester, California. And I was there because I knew someone who was building a sort of like DIY internet service. It was like an ISP, really small scale DIY internet service. And there were a lot of these scattered across the US in rural areas, kind of like mom and pop internet service providers. And the thing that was interesting to me about the coastal internet service provider that I was looking at was in Manchester, California. Since 1956, they've had this really like major cable landing station that connects the West Coast through Hawaii to Japan. I mean, it's like a major kind of backbone piece of infrastructure of the global internet. And people there had really bad internet service. So there's an irony there that was really fascinating. What I learned when I spent time there is that as a rural place, that coastal area was sort of atypical, especially politically. It was, most of the US in rural areas is quite conservative. And this area was not really, as much more kind of libertarian. And it had a lot of people who kind of moved up and bought expensive houses from like the Bay Area. And so I ended up going to Prineville just because I thought if I'm going to do rural areas in the US, I need to be looking at ones that are, have a couple cases to compare to one another and have a case that was a little more politically representative of rural communities in the US. So this, I think, is an interesting methods question, because what I found was like, oh, the physical infrastructure of the internet might be a way to think about where to go. Like, go to a cable landing station, go to a place where there's a data center cluster. And that was how I answered that question for this project. Where do I go to do ethnographic work on the digital? Okay, so to give you kind of set the scene visually, this is the area around Prineville, Oregon. This is also the citation for the book chapter if you want to write it down and like hunt it down when the book comes out in a month or two, I think. This is an area that it's high desert, so it can be quite hot, but mostly very dry. In the winters, they actually get quite a bit of snow. There are a lot of cattle ranches, juniper trees, sage bushes. The community there calls itself the cowboy capital of Oregon. They host an annual pro rodeo called the Crooked River Roundup. And the old established industries in this area disproportionately employed men. Logging, wood products, manufacturing, cattle ranching. It's the headquarters of the Les Schwab tire factory. And Les Schwab distributes tires throughout the US. Kind of famous. They had ads on TV when I was a kid. I grew up in Oregon, so this is sort of home base for me. And so this is an area that once provided a lot of blue collar jobs, but those jobs are in decline. For the timber industry, it's partly because of overharvesting and the regulation of that industry. Farms have been kind of consolidated, become corporate owned and controlled, and other shifts like automation. So many locals in this area moved to much more unstable work like seasonal firefighting, construction. And I want to make a little note before I go on about, I'm using the word like male dominated. What I mean in this case is a male dominated industry disproportionately and predominantly employs people who identify and present as cisgender men. And the power in these industries is even more disproportionately concentrated in male identified workers, and masculine occupational values prevail as sort of workplace ideals. I'll go into that a little bit more, but that's just sort of a little definitional work. So in 2011, Facebook approached local leaders about building a data center on Crook County land, the county around Prineville. And this is, you have to like think back a ways. Data centers are very much in the news right now. This is sort of a prior era where they were to store files and photos and videos and documents. All this stuff you post has to go somewhere. And so it would go into a facility like this. And it was part of that shift from storing documents on your personal computer to storing things in the cloud. And this community at that time was just kind of barely hanging on economically. The 2008 recession had really decimated this community. They had a 20% unemployment rate. 10% of residents had actually moved away because there were no jobs. But even in that context, Facebook was worried that its arrival in the community would be unwelcome. And so they hired a PR team from Portland that did a lot of kind of upfront narrative work about the data center and what they wanted it to be for this community. So I want to talk about how this new employer was reconciled with the local culture and how it was made compatible with blue collar work and workers. I have a few slides now talking about this idea of embodied masculinity in tech and disembodied masculinity in tech. And my talk and my findings really are arranged around two types of sites, and I've sort of put them side by side on this slide. On one side, there's the data center, the sort of new tech industry arrival. And on the other side is cattle ranching. I'm going to talk about a couple of different sites, but cattle ranching is a particular focus. So data centers, this is how the tech industry came to Prineville. And it seemed like a setup that was really ripe for conflict. This sort of, you can imagine people seeing it as an invasion of outsiders from Silicon Valley, from California, from a big city. And so I was very interested to hear the community story about how they kind of managed and minimized that cultural disruption, that potential cultural disruption. The other site are the sort of traditional rural industries that were male dominated in this community. I talked to people in the timber, wood products industry, and a little bit, but I talked to a lot of people involved in cattle ranching. And they talked to me about how they kind of considered whether to adopt a new digital technology, which ones they would adopt, and not just digital technologies, but which new technologies they would adopt and which ones they wouldn't, and why. And in both of these settings, I found that there was a sort of set of masculine occupational values that shaped attitudes towards tech. And people in these sites found ways to mitigate the threat that tech might pose by adapting it and accommodating it to these values. I am not the first person to look at data centers. There's especially now, there's a kind of rich, growing body of work on data centers by ethnographers. There's a great book by Alice Johnson called Where the Cloud Meets the Ground that I strongly recommend. Actually, I blurbed it, so I think it's a great book if you kind of want to get some up-to-date sort of narrative ethnographic work on data centers. But before work like Alex's work, there were people who were turning their attention to these places, mostly just like marveling, like, wow, the internet is a place. Like you can go there and there's like, it's a series of tubes, like to make that joke. There's like pipes and there's servers and you can kind of point at it and touch it. And I think the scholarship has moved on from that to get a little deeper into some of the issues around things like labor and the environment. But I think just looking at this, the data centers in Prineville, workers, of course, understood that the internet was a place. They worked there. They made and maintained it with their own labor. And I love this quote. It's from a magazine article, and the person depicted is the one who said this. And the quote is, "The internet is not a fake thing. It's a very, very real thing made with hammers and concrete and nails and blood and sweat and tears and people." Sort of the rallying call for the embodiment of the work that holds up the internet. And I didn't put the name of this person on this slide because I just want you to kind of look at this person for a minute and try to guess who this is. Just pause for a minute. Take a drink of water and you think to yourself who you think this is. This is the first director of the Prineville, Oregon Data Center. And this is sort of a glamour shot from the Facebook page for the data center. This is Ken Patchett with his cowboy hat, talking about how the internet is this thing made of blood and sweat. And so you can see from the inside, from like the management of the data center, from Facebook itself, they were trying to do this symbolic work, do this narrative work to smooth the arrival of the data center. So my overarching argument in this book chapter is this, that in communities that closely identify with traditional rural industries, specifically in the Western US, one way to work in tech and work with tech, one way that work in tech and with tech is made suitable and meaningful is by connecting it closely to values tied to embodied masculinity, this kind of masculinity of physical work and labor. And so Ken Patchett was sort of towing this line and making this narrative, like producing this narrative. And it wasn't just like what he said, it was sort of how his persona, like he embodied that idea. There is a city engineer named Eric Klan, also quoted in this magazine articles for Outside Magazine. And he said, Ken has a little bit of cowboy in him, and this is a cowboy community. And he would wear like boots, he wore the belt buckle, like he looked like he played the part really well. He would tell people that he grew up on his grandparents' dairy farm, and he would talk about how he could ride a horse. Like he was sort of just doing the whole thing to try and look like one of the boys, you know, one of the farm boys from that community. So this quote, you know, he's talking about how the internet's not a fake thing. I wanted to just comment based on what I know about data centers and the work that's done inside of them. They do entail physical work, or at least they did. It's not just made up for PR. One thing that's maybe underestimated is that building the data centers, especially these data centers in Prineville, they just kept building and building and building and expanding them. That's a lot of construction labor. And the people building these sites were union labor. I talked to those guys. They were all really happy to have that kind of work and to have it close by to where they were living. But you know, it was skilled trades, and it was blue collar kind of construction labor. I also talked to a man I'm calling Albert, who was employed for a time at a large corporate data center in Oregon. I'm not naming which one. There are a bunch of them in the area. But he said, this is a quote from him about the work. He said, it's pretty exhausting. You're on your feet all day. You're lifting servers that weigh 20 to 30 pounds. You're taking out the bad parts. You're putting in the good parts. You're putting the heavy server back on the rack. You're moving entire racks. Sometimes you're up on a ladder running cable. It's a lot of repetitive physical work. So that's a kind of firsthand account of what work inside a data center is like. And then among local leaders, I talked to all of the local leaders, and I'm naming them by their own names, about this transition and the role they played in kind of smoothing the way for Facebook to come to Prineville. They emphasized over and over again continuity, that the data center was going to bring jobs for blue collar locals to transition into. And people were always referencing this one man named Jason Beebe, who is now the mayor of Prineville. But he was described as a local guy. He served in the military. He came back and worked for the Les Schwab Tire Company. Someone who was on city council with him said, oh, he's about as blue collar and rural as you can get. And here's this guy in his early 40s who was like, my body, I can't do this, throwing tires all the time. So he found work and retrained at the Facebook data center. So a direct kind of transition from one traditional industry, local industry, into the data center. There's a man named Steve Forrester, who was the city manager. I happened to be there when they had a community meeting about housing, because they were really pressed to kind of house all the people who were in town doing construction work. And he was sort of defending the data center in light of that housing crisis. And he said, I see people who used to work with me in forest products, or people that I knew and that I grew up with that are from Les Schwab that have transitioned into these high-tech jobs. He's up there at the data center and he sees them. And several people I talked to emphasized that the data centers were providing family wage jobs. That was the phrase they used. And family wage jobs, there's actually a history of that term, and I cite it in the book chapter. It means jobs that can support dependents, the income is ample, they can support a spouse who doesn't have to work. They're targeted at men in a kind of traditional family structure. So in summary, with the arrival of the data center in Prineville, leaders in the community emphasized that data centers were physical jobs, that they were jobs that local workers transitioned into from other blue-collar industries, and that they were jobs that would potentially restore a family wage. And all of that sort of upheld this blue-collar masculinity and even suggested, restoring, going back to the way things used to be before the recession, before regulation. Okay, so that's sort of the story in a nutshell of the data center. I wanted to talk just a little bit about, before I talk about cattle ranching, the timber industry. So this was not, the data center, the Facebook data center was not the first time local leaders had to contend with disruption, like a sort of new disruption and industry disruption. They had seen a different but similarly disruptive kind of changes in the timber industry, timber processing industry around tech. Sawmills, timber processing had undergone this like huge wave of computerization. And I had one really interesting conversation about this with someone I already mentioned, Steve Forrester, who was, then the city manager, but before that, he was a sawmill manager. And this was around the time that the industry was becoming really automated. What he told me was that a sawmill might have 80 employees, and they had gone down to like 10 or 15. And 3 of the people he was employing were programmers. But the system they were using to kind of process timber had become so sophisticated that he now needed an IT director. And he learned there's sort of a pay range you have to pay an IT director. And he was shocked and kind of disturbed by that. And what he said was, that's more than my production guy that comes in at 5 a.m., 5 in the morning and works 12 hours a day. He oversees 2 shifts. He's working his guts out. I'm not going to pay this freaking IT guy that much. He actually did say freaking. That's a direct, not censoring. That freaking IT guy that much. And he was a sawmill manager, but apparently he had a boss, like, I don't know, regional sawmill manager. And his boss said, well, do you need an IT director? And he said, yeah, I have to have one. And he's like, well, then you got to pay him. And so Steve said, okay, crap. Well, yeah. And then he says, to kind of summarize this conversation, so our IT director became one of the most highly compensated people on our team because that's what they are. That's what their value is. Like, period, end of story. The economy has spoken. I think this quote I've put on the slide is great. It's, I mean, once again, visceral terms, the body, right? Working his guts out. The production guy is working his guts out. And it's not just this sort of strength, but there's this endurance component, resisting sleep. I think of Karen Levy's work on long haul truckers. If you haven't seen that work, it's great. She points to this dimension of masculine embodied work, looking at long haul truckers, and they resist sleep. I mean, that's, contentious and kind of controversial, but that's part of long haul trucking, is being able to work the hours to get to the destination and to stay awake. But at any rate, I think what to kind of take away from this little story is that, Steve Forrester, he's hiring an IT manager. He doesn't ultimately reestablish this value around embodied strenuous work or insist that has to be the highest pay range. Instead, he kind of comes to terms with the fact that the IT guy has to be paid a lot, even though he's just sitting there at a computer. He's not working his guts out. Okay, so I've talked about embodied masculinity in these sort of tech-altered workplaces, how it's kind of reinforced and restated and returned to kind of smooth the way for industry, for the tech industry, for the data center in this town. And I feel I should probably talk a little bit about what this embodied masculinity is and where that came from. And, what is embodied masculinity as opposed to what? And the as opposed to what is this other notion of masculinity as defined by intellect and rationality and the absence of emotion, a very kind of decidedly disembodied masculinity that is not really that old. It kind of emerged and solidified with the rise of the tech nerd and the computer industry. Like you could maybe look at it as the birth of a new notion of masculinity. That's how people who've written about this kind of see it. And so Ron Eglash has a great piece. He's another kind of sociologist of tech that argues that rejecting the body has been really core to the masculine nerd archetype. So I have a couple of pictures from Time magazine that I think do this work for me. There's Bill Gates, master of the universe. I don't know, is he working his guts out? He's probably not sleeping much. Is he working in a way that involves blood and sweat and tears? Probably not, right? Also, Jeff Bezos. This is great because talk about disembodied. He's literally like a head on a shelf. This could not be a better picture for this argument that I'm making. But they're both there as kind of men who have mastered the machine, right? It's their brains, it's their intellect that is doing the work and making them masters of the universe. So this is sort of a new masculine archetype. And I think it was prominent enough in 2011 to make me think that when the tech industry came to Prineville, that idea would come along with it. And what you can see from the way everyone was talking about the data center is that when it arrived in Prineville, they really did not seem to yield any symbolic ground to this altered masculinity. Okay, so this is not to say like nothing can ever change. And I've already talked about the sawmill and how this sort of notion about what is worth being, what kind of work is worthy of pay has changed. And another important factor I want to get to is the conversations I had with many men, and I've already alluded to, about the aging body, right? And that is the downfall of any individual's notion of work as being tied to embodiment and kind of masculine embodiment. Our bodies age, right? And so aging workers in traditional industries eventually have to confront their own physical limits, right? And that was the topic of conversation for many people I talked to, I interviewed, including the reference to Jason Beebe, who was working at the Les Schwab Tire Center, and he couldn't throw tires anymore. So he went into a slightly less physically demanding, but still blue collar and still embodied type of work at the data center. Okay, so moving on to talk about cattle ranching. These are depictions, they're not generative AI images. These are things I pulled from the internet long ago, and they're not my own images, but they illustrate these two archetypes. So what I want to talk about next is how masculine identified occupational values were employed to decide in these traditional industries which technologies to use and for what. So I'm drawing here from Raywin Connell's work in this book, this quite canonical Masculinities, to argue that we're already not talking about a single definition of masculinity. That book talks about masculinities, like the kind of varying competing ideas around masculinity. And even I found in the kind of cattle ranching world, there were these two kind of competing types. And I've called them cowboys and cattlemen. And that distinction came out when these cattle ranchers talked about whether tech is not for them and in relation to the occupational values of cattle ranching. So there were certain hot button issues, whether to use an ATV or a horse. ATVs, that's not a digital technology, but I'm just kind of bringing it in because it fits so well into this kind of conversation about what to use and what not to use. ATVs or horses, whether to use something like a drone to kind of do the work more efficiently. There are also kind of thoughtful conversations I had with people about using mobile phones in general, whether to do farm tourism and use social media, what to use the internet for. For the cowboys, they were generally just against the adoption of farm tech. And there's one guy I talked to, I'm calling him Trent. He was a ranch worker. He's like moving from ranch to ranch. He started in Texas and somehow he had made his way out here to Oregon in his 50s. So he's decades into this career. And he said so many things that are quotable, but one thing he said to me was, I don't want no tractor blood on me. I spend my days in the saddle. That's it. I wish I could just play the audio. I think this might be a cowboy thing, but his volume was so low. It was so hard to transcribe this interview. And I think that comes partly from working alone and partly from working around horses, because horses, I've learned, are very sensitive. So just to give you kind of a more sensory idea about what it was like to interview this guy. On the other side were the cattlemen, who were generally, they were for any way of enhancing efficiency and preserving their ability to make a livelihood and to earn a family wage. And so they were just way more open to like, oh, use an ATV. This quote, I'm calling this guy Seamus. He was running a ranch with his dad, with his son, multi-generational. And he said this thing that's quoted here: on a horse, it's hot this time of year. I don't want to go to the back corner and look for cows. So yeah, I'll get on a four-wheeler and I'll go. However the job needs to get done, I get it done, regardless of which way I do it. And that's sort of the distinction right there between the cowboys and the cattlemen. And it is very much tied to which tech to adopt and which not to. So I think what I heard from, men like Seamus, he related to kind of the aging body. He recognized that more people could participate in the work, like if they could use sort of labor-saving technologies. They had a harvester which had a clutch, and what he said is, oh, the moms and older men can share in more of the farm work with these kind of assistive technologies, basically. And he meant that quite literally. His father had a degenerative disease that meant that he was less and less able, like a muscle wasting disease. He was less able to do farm work. So some of those ways that new tech were kind of advancing were helping compensate for disabilities. And this is part of the broader conversation from many men, where they recognize their aging bodies compromise their ability to remain in and succeed in these industries. This is something Raywyn Connell talks about as well, that there's this kind of threat to masculine identity presented in losing bodily capacities. And you can imagine how that's doubly so if it also means losing your ability to earn an income. But there's sort of ambivalences in all of this. They'd say one thing and kind of go back. So Seamus, this guy who said, oh yeah, my dad can use the harvester. Also, I talked to him about mobile phones, and he said something like, I hate the internet. And then he said, kids today can't pick up much more than a phone. Like the phone itself is making our children weak, right? Okay, so the other thing I want to say about cowboys, that it wasn't just like that the work was physical and they wanted it to be kind of pure and on the land and on horses and, uncompromised by technology. They had this kind of like frontiersman's independence, like this autonomy of work idea that they would talk about. But he also said, the same guy Trent basically said he was broke. He said, cowboys don't have a nickel, but other people do. And then he said, I'm going to die somewhere, and the next guy's going to step over my body and do whatever I was doing when I died. Like he imagined himself somehow as both totally free and also unable to ever stop working, that he would be working until he fell down dead on a ranch somewhere, a ranch he didn't own because he was just traveling from ranch to ranch. But his characterization of his life was as just being free. Okay, so I talked about men. Let's talk about women. I went and looked back at a piece of work I did with Zoe Kahn, who's a recently graduated PhD student from the iSchool. And we said a lot more about women in this piece that I've cited here than I am talking about in this presentation today. So if you're interested in that side of the story, go read that. But this, I'm talking about kind of how men relate to these technologies, and you may be asking yourself, where are the women? And it was very fortunate that I met someone in this community, a woman who had gotten married, had kids on a cattle ranch, raised her 2 boys on the ranch, and then had a kind of midlife epiphany, got divorced, went to college, got a master's degree, was starting her PhD, and was very supportive of my project because she sort of knew why I might be doing this kind of research. And she connected me with a bunch of people to do interviews with, and especially a lot of women who were doing things out of that kind of mode. Like this woman depicted on the left has her own ranch. And so I talked to some women like this. But when it came to, and that's in the article, there's more of that in the article, but when it came to kind of computers, I found that computers themselves in ranching culture were really strongly aligned with women, and they were seen as part of sedentary, clerical, part-time work, and it was seen as low status. So it was the work moms and wives do, like ranch bookkeeping or going into town. On the right, the picture on the right is a cattle auction, and the red arrow is pointed at a woman. The other people here, the man in the middle is the auctioneer. He's using a microphone. He's looking at a screen, but he's using a microphone. And what you imagine an auctioneer does is what he's doing. He's like talking really fast and pointing at people. And then in the arena itself, you have 2 men who are sort of herding the cattle through to look at men. And mostly bidding on the cattle were other men. But anywhere you saw a computer, it was a woman who was operating the computer. So up there on the platform, out in the reception area, they had a bunch of computers where you'd go and enter your bids. And what I heard is that, they'd come in, it was like 1 day a month, they'd come in and do that work and get paid for it. And so it was women who were seen as the people who used the computers. And the men I interviewed tended to distance themselves from computers in a couple of ways. 2 older men I interviewed said, "Oh, I don't know much about computers," and then said, "That's above my pay grade." And Trent, the man who said all those great things about not wanting tractor blood on him, I asked him about he said he has to get his resume and send it out and find jobs, and he's always looking for jobs online. But I asked him like, what do you use to make your resume? Do you use like Word? And he said, "Oh, I try to keep a woman around that knows that thing." So his daughter would do it, or some woman he was dating would do it. And he said, "Well, when I was in high school, I learned to weld while the girls learned to type." I interviewed another farmer who I've not mentioned yet. He had actually not a cattle ranch. He had he was raising pigs. And he talked about how his wife was the one who used the computer. And what he said was, his wife would listen to him, and she was really good at typing and helping him get his thoughts down on paper. And I thought that was so evocative because he said it affectionately, but it was so clear that he saw her role as like a conduit, right? He's the one who's thinking and has thoughts, and she's the conduit to put it down on the page. She's not like the master of the machine or the master of the universe like Bill Gates. Okay, so what time are we at? So summarizing this kind of discussion around embodied and disembodied masculinity, I think this work in gender theory that Raywin Connell did, it's a couple of decades ago, but on ideas of the masculine and of masculinities is still really a useful way of framing what I saw in this part of Central Oregon, to understand the kind of gendered workplace values in Central Oregon. But I wasn't doing that just to say there's more than one masculinity. It was to really show how that shaped the adoption and use of technologies and the reception of this new tech industry And what men who kind of were confronted with new technologies did is sometimes they abstained, right? They left the computer work to be handled by women in their lives. Sometimes they accommodated it, right? So they took an ATV and recognized that it was labor saving and recognized the pragmatism of using it. And then some tech offered new options like the data center for men trying to kind of recapture this older notion of the male provider, the family wage, embodied work. I wanted to try to bring this up to date a little bit because a lot has happened since I was doing data center work in, starting in, I think my first trip to Prineville was 2015, before generative AI. And I started this talk by talking about hype and this sort of fatalism of tech hype and the idea that it often seems to accompany tech hype, which is like, tech is this thing, it will be used in this way, and all you can do is adapt to that, you can't resist it. So in 2020 at UC Berkeley, we held a conference called the Refusal Conference, which was really about directly challenging that idea. And I think what has happened with data centers, since I was looking at this one in this kind of complex of data centers in Prineville, is that there has been this kind of emergent movement around challenging and questioning and resisting data centers in communities, rural or not. And they've been successful, right? So this is a website, Data Center Watch, which is, I don't exactly know what this organization is. I found their quote really interesting. I think they're just there to kind of do, like, I think actually what they might do is opposition research on behalf of data centers. But I thought this quote was really interesting. 64 billion of data center projects blocked by local opposition. And so that's another direction that this kind of emergent process can take in communities that are faced with data centers. And if anyone, I have not been doing research, direct, like ethnographic research on this for a long time. So if anyone has comments or thoughts about this, I would love to hear them. And I mean, again, the kind of message I think is, it's really critical to listen carefully and hear directly from people who are most impacted by these developments and hear what they're saying and not dismiss it as reactionary or to dismiss surprise uses in tech as misuse, right? I think it's all part of that same kind of disciplining of ethnographic listening. Okay, so I've talked about bodies, aging bodies, and I wanted to, I've put an image here from Janaki in my research in Kerala, India. I'm going to talk about bodies again, embodiment again in a minute. But I just wanted to kind of review like sort of journey of using ethnographic methods to study the digital and how the kind of challenge of place, how I addressed the challenge of placing that work for all of these years. So when I was doing my dissertation project in Accra, Ghana, 2004, it was like 2 decades ago, things have changed, but there was this proliferation of these internet cafes. Like if you wanted to use the internet, you just walk into one of these little cafes. Cafes, a misnomer, they weren't places to go relax and have a coffee. They were just places to use a computer and, pay per minute. And I thought that seemed like the ideal place to study the internet in a country like Ghana. I thought I would walk in and there would be like a third culture there. There are great ethnographies of like, corner cafes and places where communities gather and kind of create their own community. And I just did not find these internet cafes to be like that. That was one of the first kind of realizations of that work, was that people went in and they kind of disappeared into the computer, right? They were having relationships in online spaces and they just weren't really present in the internet cafe. And people didn't use them kind of regularly enough to kind of build community or know one another. So it was, I guess, a little bit of a disappointment. It was great as a place for some weird foreigner to kind of go, because they were public and I could go in and I could meet people. But I ended up thinking, well, these are really not, this is not the place where the internet happens. This is an entry point. And I wrote my methods chapter for my dissertation, which became this journal article called The Field Site as a Network, which is sort of how I arrived at understanding like the way to kind of create a coherently citing ethnographic research when you're studying something that doesn't exist in a bounded site in a nice, neat, orderly way. In 2012, Janaki and I did this fantastic collaboration, and I had another kind of realization about place. Janaki, I was just thinking the other day about like why we picked that site. And the reason we picked that site is because a famous economist picked that site and did a study about how mobile phones were making fish markets more efficient. And so that's another interesting way to kind of pick a site. And then we went back to see, using a different epistemological lens and a different set of methods, if we found something similar or contradictory. And we did find something contradictory. We found some validation of what this economist said, but we also found some very contradictory things. The thing that's interesting, I think, from my perspective about the placing of this work is that I never went to Kerala. Janaki did all of the on-the-ground field work. And we talked and communicated through field notes, and we spent a lot of time trying to kind of get on the same page. And I think what I came to understand is how critical that researcher embodiment is to really understanding what's going on and remembering who talked to who and what they said was much harder for me, having never met or interacted with any of the people in these sites. Even with photos, even I've spent time on maps trying to like map distances between locations. And that was just a real kind of realization about what we accomplish doing ethnographic work, especially by going into and being in a field site. Some of it's just what you can kind of secure in your memory, requires that kind of three-dimensional experience. And then finally, this project, which I've just talked about, which is, I think there's sort of been this transition. I mean, now with mobile phones and the ubiquity of the internet and of kind of the digital mediation of life presents all these other challenges, I think, to trying to locate and place research. Like, where do you go to study the digital now? I mean, the internet cafe seems like this great place of very concentrated, focused attention. And how do you study the internet if it's someone using a mobile phone in a cattle auction, right? And so the way I kind of resolved that was looking at these rural communities that hosted internet infrastructure, for whom the internet had been like a kind of strange new disruption. Like hosting the data center was this kind of symbolic center of gravity that people were talking about and thinking about the internet in relation to talking about the data center. And a data center is a place you could do research. I never got access to the Facebook data center. I never got inside. They were doing tours for a time, but I was too late. So I only got secondhand accounts from other people. And my study became not what happens in a data center, but what does a data center mean for a rural community? Okay, so that's just the kind of post log to sort of get us talking about methods, ethnographic methods. And I think I can end there. What time are we at? Pretty good timing. And we have like a full 30 minutes, it looks like, to discuss methods, rurality, embodied masculinity, ethnography, fieldwork, or anything else.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And yeah, just a virtual round of applause for your wonderful presentation. I think in the Q&A, yeah, we have quite a few people online. So I think if any of the other conveners have a question to start us off, then that would be great. And then afterwards, if you'd like to raise your hand, we'll go through the list online, and we invite people to say your name and affiliation so we can get a sense of the people behind the screen as well. So yeah, Janaki, Robert, do either of you have any questions? Please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Jenna. That was fantastic, and also, yeah, took me back to Kerala. Uh, so one thing that was really fascinating to me about the research was the work of creating the narrative, right? Which I hadn't thought about that much in terms of creating a narrative in the place where the data center is being set up. So I was just curious because well, I guess two questions. One is, how did they know that that was the narrative that they had to set up for it to work there? Uh, how did they get the texture and the granularity of how this would sell? And the second then is, and maybe this is a more hypothetical question because I'm thinking in different geographies, you would have to frame it really, really differently, right? And I think you came to this a little bit later where you talked about autonomy. So I'm thinking in the context of, say, gig work in India, of course, the first narrative is around just jobs, and the second one is around autonomy. In fact, what is not being talked about very much is the physical labor that's involved. And I'm guessing in the Indian context, part of this comes from the fact that your aspiration is always for white collar, non manual work. So it would not really sell to say that, you can be on your bike and delivering stuff, and how masculine is that? So I'm just very curious about how they knew to pitch it in this way in this geography, and what you think about how that works when you go to a different place. Thanks.
Yeah. So from talking to other people studying data centers, I think there's a pretty sharp contrast. I don't know about India because I don't think that there's a lot of work on data centers in India, but data centers in Northern Europe, their narrative is totally different. It seems like it's very much either a US or rural US or Western US narrative specifically. I think it's pretty specific to that region. And there are data center clusters in places that aren't nearly as rural. I've not spent time in, like, Virginia has a bunch of data centers, and I don't think they're in as rural a place. So it'd be interesting to hear the narratives. Why they knew to use that narrative is a combination of things. One is that their data center director came from another data center in Oregon, in the Dalles. Google built this big data center in the Dalles before Facebook built a data center in Prineville. And so that data center director, I think, knew, because he had been kind of part of the conversation nearby about a different data center. And I think from his perspective, the Google data center was done under such secrecy. It was actually a big problem in that community, because they were like, what do they have to hide? Why are they being so secretive about this? And so the Facebook data center was a chance to kind of redo that. And they started out from the very beginning saying, we're transparent, we're part of the community, we want to be part of the community, we want to be a good member. They were doing tours for a long time, letting people kind of walk through and see the space. So their data center director, I think, knew, like, how to approach that audience. Also, all these local leaders, they're like members of city council, the mayor, the city manager, were talking to Facebook from very early stages. And those people know their community. So they knew that that was the right narrative. And then thirdly, they hired a PR firm. They hired this Portland-based PR firm. Their whole job was to figure out, like, how do we bring this? Like, they did ads, they did special, graphic design, Facebook posts. They did like a newspaper spread. They did a big opening event where Mark Zuckerberg came and shook the hand of the mayor. So they were very focused on the PR campaign. And they had those kind of three prongs, the three different groups that were all kind of contributing their ideas about what would work in that community.
Thank you so much. I see David's hand up if you'd like to ask your question.
Hi, thank you. That's really interesting. I should start by apologizing for being late. I somehow managed to follow an old link, and so I was on a parallel meeting with very few other people who I hope have managed to get here. So I have three rather disconnected comments more than questions. So first on masculine nerds, what perhaps might help in that discussion is wondering about shades of autism and how being on the autistic spectrum has been made to be sexy, acceptable, or call it what you will. I mean, it's a whole other aspect of nerdiness.
Right.
First. Second, oh, sorry, do you want to respond in turn, or should I do all three?
Oh, go for all three.
Okay. Women and doing low status work. I was put in mind of Diana Forsyth's work about all the invisible work, which is absolutely necessary, but low status.
Yeah.
And on data centers, of course, the version of this is cleaning. Just removing the dust without if you leave the dust there, this is how you break the internet, not being Kim Kardashian, but not cleaning.
Yeah.
And then finally, I love this idea of strange but new disruptions, but I want to take not so seriously, I want to take a slightly long-term perspective and suggest some other strange new disruptions. First, from only a century ago, the arrival of motor vehicles, and then going back a few more centuries, horses. Horses are technology, and they are an imported technology.
Yeah.
And once you start taking that sort of perspective, maybe the arrival of the data centers ain't that new. Well, no, it's new, but ain't that big a disruption. There have been other disruptions way more significant. So I don't know how you want to react, but
yeah. I mean, when you brought up women, because there's a section of this book chapter that cites Mar Hicks and Nathan Ensmerger's work on the history of programmers and how programming started out as this kind of feminine role, like it's the new office machine, and then the women learned to use it. Some of those women went, wow, this is really cool, and there's something kind of sophisticated about it, and they developed these skills which were quickly kind of taken out of their hands and handed to men who became these kind of wizards of the machine, and that became then high status and masculine work. And that's part of the chapter that doesn't fit into this talk, like the kind of history of those kind of competing notions of what kind of work is done by whom. I didn't think about cleaning though, and that did come up with the data centers. There was a lot of back and forth about, oh, who's getting these jobs? What are these jobs? People would say, oh, it's just construction jobs, and when they're done building the buildings, they won't need those people anymore. Or the server tech jobs, there aren't very many of them. Mostly what they're hiring are janitors. That came up. People said, oh, it's janitors or security guards. And I never thought to look much deeper into that. And whether janitor to me is coded as a male role, cleaning people maybe would be female. And I don't know exactly who is cleaning in those spaces or what kind of cleaning is done in the vastness of the server rooms. So now I'm intrigued to go back and look at that. I am always very self-conscious to say, well, here is the tech and here isn't. And I agree, horses are tech, right? Domesticated horses that you put a saddle on, that's tech. And it's interesting though that the people I interviewed were like, drew these really sharp distinctions. Like the purity of the work was in the tech of a horse, which they wouldn't call technology. They just say, using a horse. They talk, actually, I didn't even mention this quote, but one slide had a quote about drones, which I forgot to mention. A young man, so it wasn't always like old 50-something cowboys who didn't like tech. It was like the young 20-something guy who said, well, I think drones are useful, but it takes me out of the art of it. He called it an art. Like, he was clear that the art of cattle ranching, the art of kind of mastering this relationship with a horse. He talked about working with animals, and you could tell there was this kind of real meaning to it. And that something like a drone disrupted that sense of the meaningful work in nature. So there's sort of a shortening that I'm doing that's like, well, kind of post-silicon based technology is sort of where I'm drawing this arbitrary line. But your point is received about the arbitrariness of drawing that line, and the fact that there are all kinds of tech that they're using, some of which they call tech and some that they don't.
Thank you.
Thank you. We've got another hand up. Please go ahead and unmute.
Hi, am I audible?
Yes.
Hi, this is me, Shubham, a PhD student from the University of Oxford. Thank you, Dr. Burrell, for this wonderful presentation. I just had a question almost in a line of Dr. Janaki also, that since we know about this more desirable form of masculinity existing, which is the disembodied masculinity, as you called it, or the masculinity of the intellect of all these tech people, and I was wondering that you are bringing out a case where sorry, I meant the disembodied masculinity. You are bringing out the case where the embodied masculinity is so prevalent there, and it's almost romanticized, and there's a lot of meaning in it. But I wonder that is the disembodied masculinity making any sort of disruption there, in the form of like men migrating for that kind of work, that sort of skilling, and like it almost seems to be a different universe where embodied masculinity is taking the main role, and there is no concept of the other masculinity. So do you see that other masculinity making some sort of a impact there, some sort of a disruption, some tension with this other prevalent and dominant form of masculinity? So thank you.
Yeah, I have two comments related to that. So Prineville is this, like, there's not much to that town. It's a small town, and it really exists to kind of support people running cattle ranches nearby. But an hour away from Prineville is a town called Bend, which is a resort town. And I mean, housing there has gotten incredibly expensive. If you think of resort towns in the US, there's like Vail, Colorado, Jackson Hole, Wyoming. Bend, Oregon is starting to be one of those places. So you have really affluent people buying second homes and going there to ski. And I think what you see there is a lot of white collar workers doing telework, especially during the pandemic. But I do think Bend and Prineville are two different universes. And the people who live in Prineville are like, oh, Bend, those are not our people. And the Les Schwab Tire Company, I didn't get to talk about Les Schwab, who's a completely fascinating character. He started this tire company. I want to say he was from Prineville, but I'm not totally sure. And his company was huge. It was like, but it never went public. It was privately owned, which meant that he could kind of do things the way he wanted to do them. And he didn't have to kind of serve shareholders. And he kept his company in Prineville. He was really focused on like employing locals. It made really no sense because the warehouse would package up tires that had to be shipped to distributors, and they had to go up and over Mount Hood in the snow, in the ice. It made no sense to have a tire company there. This is from his autobiography. He's saying it didn't make sense to put it here, but he had this kind of loyalty to that community. And as soon as he died, his estate and the people who continued to own the company moved it to Bend, which was a real kind of like a violation of loyalty that, you know, his company was taken to Bend. And so I think that gives you a sense of like these two worlds. I think Bend is the world of disembodied masculinity, and Prineville is the world of embodied masculinity, maintains that idea of embodied masculinity. And the people who came to work at the data center, I mean, there weren't a lot of white collar workers at that data. Honestly, data centers don't really employ many people. They did employ locals, but you know, it's not. It employed a lot of construction workers and a certain number of server techs, and it didn't bring in a huge number of white collar Facebook workers. If you look at the buildings too, they're huge buildings. They have no windows. They don't house people. They house servers. So yeah, I do think they were really two universes. And the other story I can tell quickly is that I interviewed a man who taught shop at the local high school, because I thought that might be the closest I could get to someone kind of training and preparing young kids, like high school kids, to go into the tech industry. And in the years he was teaching kids who took shop, like the kind of engineering or mechanically minded kids, he had one kid end up going to work at the data center as like a programmer. And he talked about that kid like he was some sort of weirdo. Like the kid had no friends and all he did was program all the time. And then he got hired. So that was sort of, I think he was seeing a kid who was representing this disembodied masculinity and thought he was not of that community, like not kind of understandable. And so, yeah, I do think those worlds really didn't mix, and I don't see it changing. I could be wrong, but I don't see it changing anytime soon, because they found a way to embrace tech without undermining that idea that masculinity is in the workplace is embodied.
Right, thank you. So you were saying that there was a mixture of the worlds, but even when there was a mixture of the worlds, they embraced the technology without embracing the masculinity associated with it. So they rather subordinated the people who went for that kind of
Yeah, the
profession.
material came, the tech, the servers, the tech, the building, the brand came, but the reading of it was symbolically repurposed, really, in a way that was not culturally threatening.
Yeah, but did it not make any difference that this kind of jobs were more white collar and more high paying? Because whatever is high paying is always kind of associated with more masculinity. So
I mean, I didn't hear people talk a lot about like Mark Zuckerberg as a person, right? Like those figures just didn't loom large in the lore of people I talked to. And that's a huge contrast to Ghana. In the internet cafes in Ghana, people were always talking about Bill Gates and aspiring to be someone like that. And that just wasn't part of how people in Prineville, the local leaders or men in these traditional industries, they just didn't aspire to that.
thank you so much.
Thank you. And we have a question from Robert now.
Yes, thank you. And thank you, Jenna, for that wonderful talk. My question is related to maybe the last part where you were talking more about methods. Recently, I was reviewing a paper by an author who I think, yeah, cited your the field site as a network work paper, and was, trying to discuss the research they did, which was essentially creating an account on TikTok and spending 3 months just seeing what the algorithm recommended them. And they talked about this as digital ethnography and the field site as a network. And I was just curious how you feel about this, because I'm sure you've come across this sort of proliferation of the term digital ethnography, I guess it also says something about how, related to your comment about how quickly these things are changing and naturalizing, but how so much more of the online sites we engage with are algorithmically personalized. and how you can, whether or not this qualifies as digital ethnography in your minds.
Oh, that's a great question. I mean,
Yeah.
the description of it, I think, oh, that sounds too superficial to call ethnography. Like, I mean, you can do interesting research. You don't have to label it one way or another. And
Right.
I mean, I myself did a study of the Twitter algorithm. I did this study with some students where we were I was really interested in the way people use the word algorithm in Twitter, in tweets. This was like years and years ago before the whole Elon Musk thing. So people would talk about algorithms on Twitter, and they'd talk about the Twitter algorithm on Twitter. And it was fascinating. We pulled all these tweets that referenced that. We did not call it ethnography. It was sort of a,
Yeah.
and it wasn't quite even content analysis. It was sort of a text analysis. We're trying to look at kind of the range and spectrum of ways people talked about the algorithm and tried to kind of exert control over the algorithm, but we didn't call it ethnography. And I guess if you create a TikTok account and see what's recommended, you're a kind of a participant. It's just such a narrow little corner of the world, and it's only you, and it's so hard to know even what's going on with those recommendations, like, because we can't access the algorithm directly. Was it interesting work? Did you find it convincing apart from the method?
Yeah, it struck me that, wow, that this um, this going online used to mean that you had to engage with other people. And so the idea that, okay, this is kind of an online space that somewhat resembles offline spaces, communities where you have to engage with others, and it makes sense. But when you're simply in your account and you're just faced with the content that gets recommended based on your own actions, you might be able to talk about this in an autoethnographic sense, but even then, there's no engagement with anyone else, right?
That's right. That's the essence, right? Like there has to
Yeah,
be some kind of interaction with another person. I mean,
yeah,
personally, like I have
yeah,
read some great online ethnographies that I find very convincing as ethnography. Like you're in a online environment and you're there for a sustained period of time and you build an identity and you get to know people. They're great ethnographies that are purely virtual. But I mean, the field site as a network was about it was about my dissertation research, which was going to an internet cafe, sitting with people, seeing who they talked to online, seeing what relationships they had, seeing how they talked about those relationships, seeing how they presented themselves, sometimes misrepresented themselves, and then going home with them, and then going to church with them, and then going to like finding out what places outside of the internet cafe were important to them, and it was like, I was inspired by George Marcus's writing about that. It was following people to find that whole web of relationships, both offline and online, to understand the whole of what it meant to be a young internet cafe user. And also, just like in Pineville, they were talking about the internet in churches. They were talking about internet cafes in the news, like local newspapers. And so all of that came together to kind of give a much richer idea about internet cafes. I mean, if you write something that people cite, you can't control them. Use it to justify things that you're like, I don't know if I'd call that ethnography. But I think it's also sometimes tempting because that word sounds very robust, like
I
I'm
know,
doing
I know. That's
ethnography.
exactly what I thought. Okay, then in my review, I'll write, I talked to Jenna and she said blah, blah, blah.
You can blame
Can
me.
I just add to that? To Robert's comment, to Robert's review, I think you just collecting the recommendations isn't enough. If you want it to be ethnography, you've got to talk to people. You may be using DM, but just collecting the recommendations isn't enough. And then for the field site is in a network, I just want to put my old plug in for the precedents of good old Malinowski for for doing this. Argonauts of Western Pacific is nothing but a network study.
Mm.
And so, so anthropology got here first.
Yeah, okay. I was just citing Malinowski the other day. We're thinking about the book on research methods that I want to write. And so it's time to get serious about reading those kinds of canonical works. You've reminded me that I should sit down and just read it.
Thank you.
I can add just one more thought to that. I don't know why we are all sort of contributing to your review, Robert, but to me, it also seems essential that you understand how the technology fits into people's larger lives, which is just impossible when the focus is on what is getting generated for you. So that whole placing of the specific topic of your inquiry within larger lives and processes of meaning making, I don't understand how that would be almost impossible to do if you just. So anyway, yeah, one more thought to add to that.
Yeah, I fully agree.
Thank you. I know we only have 4 minutes left. I actually have a question if there's time to sort of throw that out there. And then if anyone wants to think of a last minute question, we can always see if we can fit it or share them with Jenna afterwards as well. Thank you so much. That was so interesting. And some of your work was the earliest work that I read when I was getting introduced to digital ethnography and infrastructure. So it's really exciting. I had a really quick comment about the disembodied masculinity, which was just, I wonder if there's something interesting around these people rejecting this emerging masculinity coming from AI safety culture in itself. So this sort of test grill argument about body optimization and the glorification of preserving digital future humans and AI agents. But my core question, I guess, is based on my own interest in data center resistance in my PhD. And that was whether in your study on masculinity, whether there were any links to national identity and the construction of data centers in local places, because I guess when you made that link towards more contemporary data center development, a lot of that now is so linked to economic nationalism, geopolitics, kind of AI race narratives. And I just sort of wondered that because of this link between not only working class identity and rural nationalisms, but also data centers and nationalism. So be curious if you had reflections on that.
Yeah, the interviews were before a lot of the most, there was this wave just as I was transitioning out of Berkeley to data and society around really trying to, I think, squelch the critique of AI by pointing to the race with China. And the work in the data centers I did before that conversation really became so dominant in the kind of public discourse. And so I heard nothing from locals. I think there was an interesting thing that I had to do. I showed up, a white woman with ties to Oregon, but a professor from UC Berkeley. And you can imagine it was a little tricky to navigate. I would say I was from University of California. And if you know anything about California, Oregon, I grew up in Oregon. So Oregon is like California. Those are the people who move up here and they ruin property prices. And so there was this kind of not quite political conversation that happened. People didn't talk explicitly about, they didn't really talk explicitly about politics, except very, very local politics about things like what kind of zoning was in place for the data center and what tax breaks were on the books and what they could negotiate. And so people didn't talk to me at all about national politics. And it could be because I was this professor from UC Berkeley and they thought they didn't want to confront me about it. And also I was an ethnographer. So I'm there asking from your point of view, blah, 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 blah. And I didn't have any questions about that sort of thing in my interview guide, and it didn't come up at all. Interestingly, the because I could see on social media what people are talking about. Like there's a public Facebook group for that community. Their mayor at the time, Betty Ropey, who I talked to, was a Republican, and she told me she's married to a Democrat. And I almost see that as kind of an old guard of politics. The new mayor, the guy who was working at the data center, ex-veteran, transitioned from Les Schwab, very pro-Trump, from what I could see on social media. I just don't know how that fits into the kind of data center scene, though. Like it didn't come up at all when I was talking to people. But it could be now, like if I were to go back, there'd be a much bigger kind of sense of what it meant to have a data center, like from a national perspective, from an AI race perspective, and I'm sure there's more awareness now in that community about data center resistance, people trying to kind of protest and stop data centers. Good reason to go back, if I dare. I dare to go back.
Thank you so much. And yeah, there's so much to follow up on. So yeah, please let us know if you'd like to continue the conversation as we're towards the end of the talk. But yeah, thank you so much, Jenna. I just want to give you a last sort of virtual round of applause. Thank you for joining us. And yeah, this was such a wonderful talk and closing out the seminar as well for this term. And I hope everything in Japan goes well as well for your next steps.
Yeah. Thanks so much. And anything that, like, if I've mentioned something or a name or a citation, please email me. I'm happy to pass along references or preprints or anything else.
Thank you so much.